Christianity today is comprised of more than 45,000 denominations. Some sects believe in the Trinity, other sects believe in modern miracles, some sects reject all modern conveniences, while others operate as a get-rich-quick scheme. How do these denominations have such radical interpretations of the same text? Members of each denomination often say that the other sects are deceived, or that they have
alternative facts.
Which tempts one to ask the question, if you are deceived, how would you know? A simple explanation might be that few even understand the text from a historical perspective. When the average Christian picks up their Bible, they are often looking at the text from a theological or spiritual perspective. That is to say, they are viewing the text with the goal of answering questions about God or obtaining instructions on how they should engage in religious ritual, looking for wisdom, seeking hope, or affirming tradition. In this video, we'll be looking at the Bible strictly from a historical perspective. Our question will be, how do we know what actually happened? And we'll be examining the evidence without attaching any theological interpretations. To do this, we'll be noting the historical context in which the Bible has arrived to us today. Then, we will compare the information that we do have, to see if we have overlapping accounts. For the sake of convenience, we will be comparing the four Gospels, which retell the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So, let's get started with a couple minutes of New Testament history. The Gospels are anonymous, with the titles Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John attributed to them in the 2nd century. The Gospel of Mark was probably written around 70 CE, approximately 40 years after Jesus died. Matthew and Luke around 80 to 85 CE, around 55 years after Jesus had died, and John during 95 CE, about 65 years after Jesus had died. Originally Mark, the earliest Gospel, does not include the virgin birth or the disciples' encounter with the resurrected Jesus. It ends abruptly at the empty tomb, with the scholarly consensus that Mark 16, 9-20 was a later adaptation to the writings. Most Bibles note this. The majority of New Testament scholars agree that the Gospels likely do not contain eyewitness accounts. Instead, they represent theologies of their communities rather than the testimony of eyewitnesses. The language of Jesus and his disciples is believed to be Aramaic. However, the Gospels were originally written in Koine Greek. It is from this language that we translate Bibles today. And finally, we have no original manuscripts. The oldest surviving parchment is called P52. This includes sections of the Gospel of John, dated to around 125 CE, or approximately 95 years after Jesus had died. The earliest copy of Mark we have is dated to around 200 CE, 170 years after Jesus died. The first complete copy of Mark, which you may remember is our earliest Gospel, is dated to 370 CE, 300 years after the original was written. It is now a good time to note that for the first 360 years of Christianity, there was no New Testament. Rather, there were a collection of stories, traditions, and writings that were being circulated between different Christian sects. It wasn't until 367 CE that we have our first reference to all the books of the current Christian New Testament, and it wasn't until 393 CE that an official New Testament was canonized. And finally, the canonization of the Bible excluded hundreds of early Christian and Jewish writings, including many writings quoted or referenced in the books that were included. Knowing this context helps us in attempting to piece together the events of Jesus' life. For the sake of vigorous investigation, let's attempt to imagine ourselves as an investigation unit coming to the scene of a crime. Our goal is to find out what actually happened. We examine the evidence systematically, and we remove as much bias as possible. That is to say, we cannot go into this investigation already assuming a verdict. Let's look at one of the most important scenes in the New Testament, the death of Jesus on the cross. First off, if you like videos like this, consider hitting subscribe because these videos take me ages to make, so I'd greatly appreciate it. Alright, let's keep going. Okay, so we have 4 separate accounts of the crucifixion narrative. Our earliest one is obviously Mark, so we'll start there. So let's examine the text and write down everything that happens point by point. Then we can do the same for Matthew, Luke, and John. Okay, so let's go through Mark. From 12 to 3 p.m. there was darkness for 3 hours. At 3 p.m. Jesus cried out loudly, my God, why have you left me alone?" Some of those standing there said, "Listen, he is calling Elijah." Someone collected sour wine and put it into a sponge. That same person put that sponge on a stick and gave it to Jesus to drink. That same person said, "Let him alone, let us see if Elijah will come and take him down." Jesus then gave a loud cry. Jesus then gave up his spirit and died. The curtain of the house of God was torn in two from top to bottom. The captain of the soldiers was looking at Jesus when Jesus cried out. The captain saw Jesus die and said, "For sure, this man was the Son of God." Some women were standing watching from a distance. The women included Mary Magdalene, Mary, and Salome. The women had also followed Jesus. The women were followers of Jesus and had cared for Jesus in Galilee. Many other women had come from Jerusalem, were also there. Okay, so that's our earliest account of what happened to Jesus as he died on the cross. Okay, so now we can compare that to Matthew. Does Matthew's account differ at all to the account in the earlier Gospel of Mark? Let's see. So I've coloured in the dot points. Green equals very similar, orange equals differs in small details, and red equals a contradiction. So let's have a look. It was a different person that said, let him alone. Mark also doesn't mention that the earth shook, that the graves opened up, and that corpses rose from the dead and appeared to many people in Jerusalem. In fact, Matthew is the only gospel that mentions that part of the story. Moving on to Luke. So the first part is the same. Then we have some blatant contradictions. Suddenly the curtain of the sanctuary and the temple was torn down the middle before Jesus died. Then Jesus shouted, saying his last words that were, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. When the Roman officer overseeing the execution saw what happened, he worshipped God and said, surely this man was innocent. Okay, so it's important to note that most scholars believe that Matthew and Luke use Mark as a base text, and that explains why John differs so wildly. So the two major contradictions in John, when Jesus tasted it, he said, it is finished, and Jesus bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So if you put them side by side, you can see quite clearly that as time moves on, the stories tend to change a little bit, and as a result, contradictory accounts emerge from the rubble. The beauty of this technique is you can use it on any story in the Gospels, in any translation of the Bible, and when you ask specific questions, contradictions start to appear. You don't have to take my word for it, you don't have to take anyone's word for it, you could look at it yourself. Who is Joseph's dad? Who is Joseph's granddad? When did Satan tempt Jesus? How did Judas die? When did the Last Supper occur? Looking at the resurrection account, who was it that goes to Jesus' tomb? Was the stone rolled away when they got there? Who did they see when they got there? Are the disciples told to stay in Jerusalem or go to Galilee? Do the women tell the disciples? If they do tell the disciples, what do the disciples do? You may consider that these contradictions are just small things, trivial things. The problem is, how do you determine the difference between a small thing and a big thing without appealing to theology? Remember our question from the start. We are not asking about theological importance, but rather asking about the accuracy of the accounts. Are they historically reliable? Don't trust me, don't trust your pastor, and don't trust your priest. Pick up your Bible and find out.